Views expressed by Camaplan podcast guests may not reflect those of Camaplan. Camaplan does not guarantee the accuracy of information provided by guests, nor does it endorse or recommend any individual or organization. Camaplan is not an investment advisor, CPA, realtor, or attorney. You are encouraged to conduct your own due diligence before making investment choices. For any tax, legal, accounting, investment, or other questions, please consult a specialist. Hi, I'm Michael Duncan, and welcome back to The Road to Financial Freedom. This podcast is brought to you by Camaplan, a self-directed IRA administrator focused on educating investors on how to grow retirement savings faster through alternate investments. In each episode, we're going to take an in-depth look at the many roads taken to financial freedom and how they differ for each of our guests. Our goal is to help the listeners learn how they can achieve their own financial freedom through the experience and stories of experts that have done just that. Today's guest is coming to us from Ideal Wealth Grower, where he acts as a turnkey and residential real estate mentor and host of his podcast called The Ideal Investor Show. I'm very excited to welcome Axel Meierhofer to the show. Axel, how are you doing this morning?
Yeah, I'm great, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, the guests can't see us, but you look like you are on a beach in Spain. I'm very jealous with this cold weather this time of year, but it looks like you're just having a great time getting ready for Christmas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's part of the reason we came here. I mean, there were a few other reasons, but yeah, I'm normally in San Diego, which is also not really a bad place to be from a weather perspective. But for many, many years, coming originally from Germany, we've always basically stayed in the US. And this year we decided, okay, my mom is here and the family is here in Europe, and being in Spain is probably a cool thing. And since we're talking about financial freedom, I finally felt, okay, I've worked hard enough to actually afford this, so might as well do it,
Yeah, I mean, what is money if you're not going to be able to spend it on experiences and, seeing loved ones and stuff like that, in my opinion.
Right, exactly.
Some of the best ways to spend it. So I do want to get a little bit into your background to start. So like you mentioned, you're from Germany originally, and you relocated to the United States. At what age or like when in your life did that happen?
Well, I came over to the US when I was about 33 as part of an exchange program between the United States Air Force and the German Air Force. I was flying for the German Air Force and found out about this program, applied for it, and with a little bit back and forth, I was accepted. So I literally became a member of the US Air Force, and the person whose job I took basically took my job and became a member of the German Air Force for a little more than 2 years.
That's incredible. And I didn't even know that was really an option, a thing that existed.
I didn't either
until you heard about it, I guess. And you were like,
right, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that led to you, was that kind of the first time you had ever spent an extended period of time in the United States?
Yeah, for an extended period of time, for sure. What had happened is part of my flying duty, or the work that came with flying the jets, I was part of testing new equipment. And most of the new equipment actually came from companies in the United States, like, at the time, Texas Instruments and some other, like Lockheed Martin and those kind of companies. And obviously, when they had a new product that was supposed to be integrated into the planes, as somebody working in that capacity, we had to go to these companies to get training. For one, to learn how they operate, but also then to create basically the checklists and documentation for the actual units in the military. So my wife and I had come over a couple of times for like 3, 4, 5 weeks of training. And that was actually what triggered even to search, right? Because we said, wow, we really like it. We were lucky we went to Texas and California and places with nice weather.
Yeah.
And we said, it's nice to come here, but it's basically no time, right? These trainings were really intense. So we said, wouldn't it be nice if there was somehow a way to stay longer, like you just said, right? And so I started looking into it, and I didn't really know what I would find. And I found this exchange program. And as the exchange program came to an end, normally after 2 or 2.5 years, we would have gone back. But I was notified by the German military that the governments had decided to build a flight training center in the US, and I was already there. So instead of going back home, I got extended for another 3 years to help build this training center. And by that time, I got to an age, you can add it up together, I was approaching 40. And when you get to that age, it's kind of like the Tom Brady thing, right? Very few people can still keep flying.
Yeah.
He's obviously the exception.
Yeah,
I know a few others who were able to fly beyond 40. But for me, physically, it just got harder and harder. But we had at that time stayed in the US for almost 6 years, and my daughter went to school in the US and everything. So same thing in a way, right? We said, well, is there a way to stay? And a company in California offered me a job as an executive in a software company. So I said, well, if you can take care of the visa, green card, all that kind of stuff, then we're happy to take that opportunity. And that's why we're still there, so.
That's incredible. And so from what I gathered from your website, you were at the software company, and then the Great Recession in like 2008, 2009 in the United States, that's what initially led to you, I guess, investing and kind of making a living out of real estate. Do you want to tell us, I guess, how you got into that? Like what caused that to happen?
Yeah, it wasn't just like one instance like that. What had happened is I basically retired from the military, got this job there in the software company, and tried to understand how the system really works in the civilian world. How do you actually build retirement money or anything like that? Excuse me. And I found out normally people have like a 30, 40-year career. Right? And I knew at that time I wasn't going to work that long, or didn't want to work that long. So it wouldn't be easy to get any kind of significant retirement amount of money together. So I thought, well, what else can I do? Now, keep in mind, there was the dot-com bust in like 2003. And then, like you just mentioned, the financial crisis started to kind of show up 2008. So I was looking at what can I do to build something in addition to maybe some social security payments in the future. And I looked around and I was kind of not really into stocks. So real estate became the thing. And I first did what most people, if you interview anybody in the real estate community, you will find, myself included, most people first really try to get educated, right? Really try to dig in and find out how does this work? Because it's very different when you say, I buy a house for myself to move in and live there with my family, or doing real estate, or pretty much any other way of investment for the purpose of investment, and in our case, for the purpose of generating passive income and ultimately financial freedom. And so I, for years, between basically 2005 and about 9 or so, 10, I started digging into the education side. And then when I saw all these houses around, losing massive value through the crisis, we started thinking, okay, we should do something too. Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense. You were looking for passive income, and clearly you found that. Yes. All these years later, you've now got idealwealthgrower.com and a podcast where you talk about this kind of stuff. And when you go to your website, the first thing that you notice, or at least I'm sure the design, is a quote about the time freedom point. Mm-hmm. When I picture that, I picture a graph of some sort, a mathematical graph, where it's like you're looking for a point upon a line where the time you have is matching up with the freedom that you have based on wealth. Can you tell me a little bit about what I guess that means and why that is kind of the slogan, I guess, of what you guys are doing at idealwealthgrower.com?
Yeah. And you have described it pretty well. The way I describe it is, if you, for yourself or for anybody in the audience, you ask yourself, how much money do I currently need to cover my life expenses, including going on vacation here and there, getting a new vehicle, for example, or anything that might be your hobby that you're into, taking care of the family, those kind of things. How much money per month do I really need? And let's just, for sake of an argument, say you were to come to the conclusion to cover that on a regular basis, long term, my number would be $4,000 a month. Right? It could be any number. I'm just making this as an example. So then what we do is, for this line that you describe, even though I'm rather using more the example of a calendar, what we're trying to look at is to say, okay, how much do I need to have in residential real estate investments so that it pays me safely $4,000 a month? We call that your time freedom number. And the reason is that we basically look at it as when that day comes, that you consistently get $4,000 of passive income from your investments, you now have the freedom to decide what you want to do with your time. Up to that point, in most cases, there are lucky exceptions and stuff, but in most cases, what you really do is exchanging your time for money, whether it's hourly or a salary or some gig or multiple jobs, you're exchanging your availability to someone else to get paid. And the time freedom point is thereby, for us at least, defined as that date on the calendar when you no longer have to do this. Now, obviously, both the accumulation of the assets, meaning like houses in real estate or duplexes or stuff like that, is a gradual evolution over time. And that can also happen with your freedom to use your time. Right? When you get to $2,000 a month, you might say, okay, well, I don't really need to do 3 jobs anymore. I limit it to 1. When you get to 3,000, you might say, I don't really want to do this full time anymore. I've talked to my employer, I do maybe 30 hours a week. And when you really get to the 4,000, you can say, well, I don't like to do 30 anymore, but I like my job. So maybe I do half time if the employer is willing. Right? Or you say, I've hated it for the last 10 years and I'm finally at my point and I don't need to do it. I want to be a sculptor, a painter, a gardener, whatever you want to do. Right? But that's kind of like how we look at it. And that's why you're right when you say there is kind of a graph, but it's very individual. Because your number, Michael, might be 6,000. My number might be 7,000. Somebody else's number might be 4,000 or 5,000. So that's the starting point. And then it's a matter of, okay, how much does each investment that I'm going to do, hopefully with our help, generate in passive income? So some may generate $300 a month. Others may generate $400 a month, $500 a month, right? So let's just say, just because the calculation would be easy, you had actually investments one after the next that generate $500 a month. And you want to get to 4,000, right? So you know you need 8 of those, not all at once. I mean, most people at least can buy 8 properties right away, but over time you can buy maybe 1 a year or 1 every 18 months. And when you got 8, you will have your $4,000 coming in if each one of those gets you 500. Now, if the number is 250, you need 16, right? So that relationship of what's my number, what we call the time freedom number, and how many investments do I need to have, gives you the framework. And then we just start working with your individual situation to look at what can we do to get the first one and the second one and so forth and so forth. And in most cases, the reality is that you never really need to quite acquire as many as you thought when we start, because obviously those $200, $300, $400 are not static, right? Because your costs when you buy a house and rent it out, let's say you start out with $250 a month, you would not keep that house for the next 8 or 10 years and never increase the rent.
Correct.
Right. So, and your costs, meaning like what you pay for mortgage, insurance, maintenance, those kind of things pretty much stay the same. The one variable that actually increases pretty predictably is the rent. Right. And there's always a significant portion of that rent going in your pocket. Right. So if you say, okay, I have $250 in year 1 for this investment, year 8, if you really were to able to buy a house every year, 8 years later, it's probably more like $400. Right? And that's for that first property. And if you think about this through all the properties you're ultimately going to acquire, if you said it takes 8, it might be good enough to 6 or 7. Right? Or you might say, well, now that I'm 8 years later, my $4,000 isn't enough anymore. I need to get $5,000. So you get another house and then maybe it's still 7 or 8. Right? So those are the variables that we play with. And then as we're basically on this trajectory, or we call it the path to early retirement, then we can also start looking at other components that really build a legacy and really make you independent, not just financially, but also with estate plans and corporate structures and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. The way you describe the time freedom point is really interesting, especially because, you know, I feel like retirement is a very specific word. It puts a very specific image in our mind of I turn 65 and then I go home. And that's kind of it. You start collecting whether it's Social Security or 401k, whatever.
Exactly.
But the way you describe the time freedom point is really interesting from the point of view that it's just, like I come from a very big family, and I have more than one uncle that is retired. And one of them retired and went on to, retired, quote unquote, and went on to work 40 hours a week doing exactly what he was already doing. Another opened a brewery. And it's like they are bored of retirement. They got bored within months of being, quote unquote, retired. And I think it's interesting the way you describe the time freedom point, because it's not about retirement. It's about choosing what you want to do with your time. I mean,
yeah, exactly. And I mean, one of the core things when we get a little bit philosophical about it is I oftentimes ask people who are interested whether they heard about it when you and I have a podcast, or they read something, an article I wrote, or they came to the website, or whatever it may be. And I ask them, how would you define or describe your own purpose in life?
Yeah.
Right. And when you go to that, it oftentimes starts becoming a conversation about what are you really passionate about?
Yeah.
And that then leads to, okay, of these things that you're saying you're really passionate about, how much can you afford and allow yourself to really do this to a large extent of the time available? And what we find is there are all kinds of amazing things that people are passionate about and that they would like their purpose of life to be revolving around. But then there is this nasty thing that you somehow have to fulfill your obligations to the family and to others and to yourself and to your employer and stuff. So that passionate, purpose-driven aspect gets reduced for these other obligations. And so it's one thing to describe the time freedom point and the journey towards it in a kind of like mathematical way. But what also happens is that it is somewhat inspirational for anybody who is willing to get on that journey, because when you see that you're actually working towards the freedom to live your passion and purpose, that really releases additional energies, additional creativity to say, well, maybe this one thing that I thought I wanted to spend money on, I rather keep that money for my investments to accelerate the time that it takes me to get to this point. So there is more to it than just the number. There is this aspect of getting to the opportunity to really live your passion. And that's, I think, in a sense to what you said, these uncles, most likely, if you ever ask them, regardless before or after their retirement, what do you see as your purpose in life? It wasn't to finish a job and then be at home and basically no longer following a routine. It was most likely something different. And so they exchanged one thing that they felt they had to do with hopefully something that they really like to do. Right. And the beauty is, if you do it in the way that we recommend, basically having the time freedom point and that number for yourself in mind, is that you can make the choice of what this passionate pursuit of purpose is without financial inhibitions. Right. Because oftentimes people say, I would love to, I've always liked painting and being creative, but it doesn't pay unless you're famous. Well, if you reach the time freedom point, or even shortly before you get there, it doesn't matter. Because you know financially you're safe, now you have the freedom to do it whether it pays or not.
Yeah, you're spot on. I agree with everything you just said. And it is very interesting because I think there are some people that maybe they work 40, 50 hours a week, but that's what they're really passionate about and they love doing what they do. So maybe they already reached their time freedom point because they don't need passive income to support the lifestyle that they're passionate about, and they are, what they want out of life. But then there are a lot of people that don't have that opportunity, and I think that's very important to touch upon, and a very important, difference between the time freedom point and just the idea of general retirement.
Right. Yeah. Well, if I may say one thing about this, is that there is a component to it that is oftentimes not necessarily illuminated very much. And I would say that component that's really important is risk. Yes. Right. If you go and say, okay, I'm really passionate about fill in the blanks, right? Painting or sculpting or woodworking or whatever. Theoretically, anybody who has discovered a passion that the person would say, I could do this all my life. The next step would then be, okay, can I sustain myself and family and the rest of my life with following this passion? And that immediately brings the question, okay, if the answer to that were, yeah, I would love to, what's the risk? Then you go and look a little bit into like small business development and stuff like that. And you find like anybody who starts a new business, 80% of those go under in the first 5 years. And of the remaining 20%, 80% also go under in the next 5 years. So I don't know math that well, but it's probably less than 5% of those who start actually succeed, and succeed in a way where you can say they're not just barely scraping by, but they made their business into something that is kind of similar or equal to what we call the time freedom point. The business pays for itself and stuff like that, right? Like if you think about the extreme example of that would be somebody like Elon Musk, right? Like he has done multiple businesses, and each time he was willing to take the risk. When people interview him, he's constantly pointing out how often he was right at the point of bankruptcy, but he sometimes through luck and sometimes through ingenuity and sometimes through friend, he was able to avoid it ultimately. While the vast majority of people are not. So when you go to what you mentioned, right, like we all would like it, but why don't we do it? Why do the vast majority of people end up being in some sort of a job? Is we might have the inkling that there's something that we would really love to do and occupy all our time. And then it wouldn't be 40 hours, it would be 60, 80, 100 hours. Yeah. But the risk of failing is relatively high. And if you take that and look at our approach, where you say you basically keep the safety net of a job for as long as you need or feel comfortable to have that while you're building your passive income, then it is no longer a gamble. It's no longer a risky thing. Your residential real estate, your 8, 9, 10, however many houses you accumulate over time, they will be there. And there are three things, I'm getting a little passionate about this, three things that we all know we need as human beings. We need food, we need shelter, and we need safety. Mm-hmm. I always say, okay, I like gardening, so I do food just for the family. I did safety with the military for 22 years. And now I'm into getting shelter for myself and others. But the fact that we need shelter will never go away, right? And in these times right now, interest rates are really high. More people need to rent shelter. When interest rates are really low and incomes are good, people can buy shelter. But you need one way or the other, right? And so that's also when people say, well, what's the risk? You know, what is going to happen over time? My answer is, without going into the details, people will need shelter. So if you give a nice 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a little garden for a fair price, they will rent it, especially if you keep it up. And so they don't mind that you make $300, $400, $500 a month over time after the rent and everything is, the mortgages and everything is paid, because they get fair value, right? And so those things are, in my view, important, because when you say, what's the alternative? I would always say, well, start a business and be successful. If that's too risky, then do what we recommend and get to your time freedom point the safe way.
So, okay, so just to go right into that, I'm brand new to all of this. I schedule an appointment with you, and I guess without necessarily trying to sell me on it, I'm already sold on wanting to do what you do. Right. What is my next step? What are you now informing me to do? What are we doing to get to this time freedom point?
You kind of took the first step already by clicking on this free strategy call on the website that you can set up. And let's say you were to do this, I would basically interview you in two directions. First, to find out what is kind of like the overall current financial situation, your income, your savings, what have you done before, where did you put your money, what is your risk structure, are you relatively young and willing to take more risk or less risk, that kind of painting that picture of what is your philosophy around money and what have you done with it so far. And then the other part of it is to say, okay, to what we've been discussing so far is, where would you go and how fast do you want to get there? So when we have established that, then if we were, let's say you, Michael, were to say, okay, this all sounds good, I want to work with you, with me in this case as your mentor, then we would basically get into the mentoring program. You can go on the website and get that. And then we would basically start looking at what is your current financial situation. So I just give a quick scenario. Let's say you had told me I have currently $25,000 that I could invest, keeping everything else to my personal preference safe, and the way I have it, I can use 25,000 and a certain amount of money every month that you can put aside. So I would say, okay, the first thing I would recommend for you is take these 25,000 and let's practice investing in residential real estate. The same way we will soon also invest in a full-on single-family home. And I would show you which platform we use. We use this platform for basically two purposes. The one is when somebody doesn't quite have enough to buy their first property. Because I can tell you in this day and age, you have to assume somewhere between 30, 35,000 to really get going with the first purchase. Like we said, you have 20 or 25,000, so you're not quite there yet, but we can get you in the platform to actually purchase parts of the same kind of houses that you will ultimately buy. You do this to get to your number, to start for the first purchase, the 30 to 35,000, and later, when let's say you reach this middle of next year or so, now we buy the first property, take that money from the platform, buy the first property as a down payment, and finance the rest. Then obviously these $200, $300, $400 a month start coming in. And you would pump that back into that platform until it has basically accumulated together with your regular monthly savings for the next one and the next one and the next one. And in the meantime, from session to session to session, not only are we going to analyze what will your investments be according to your plan and according to your financial means, but I'm also going to educate you how can you actually get on a trajectory that will ultimately end up with, 7, 8, 10, 12 houses, an estate plan, a business that you're running for the operation of your portfolio and all those things. Now, if I were to give you all of that in the first 4 weeks, it would be like drinking from a fire hose. So we're doing this, focused on getting you to your first investment as soon as possible, and a little bit of education session by session. And that's also maybe for your audience important to know. Some people say, Axel, why do you have this crazy thing like a lifetime mentoring program? Right? And I said, well, I want people to not have to worry that there's a clock that runs out. Yes, we have also something shorter when you say, I just want to get started and then I take it from there. But if somebody says, I want to have the ability to get this support, I don't want to have money to be in the way, right? So you go on the website, you sign up for the lifetime program, you pay once, and then for however long it takes, we work together, or however long you like it to be that way. And obviously it's very intense in the beginning for about the first year, and then it becomes a more as needed basis, because when you got your first few investments and you went through the whole education stuff and so forth, then you would probably contact me and say, hey, I have a new deal. Can you review it? Let's talk about it. Can we have another session? And I have clients who contact me 3-4 times a year for the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, right? It's passive for a reason, right?
Well, but it's also, as you learn, as you do the actual investments, as you see the money comes in, as you do the investments on the platform, as you basically form your LLC, as you get ready to get your corporate structure in place, all these kind of things that are currently sounding like, I don't even know what Axel is talking about. Agreed. They will all start falling into place. And the more they do, the more sense they start making. So the need to check for everything. And I love for people to contact me and say, hey, I think you mentioned this, but I'm not quite sure. Can you just look at it? And I do that, right? Even if it's just to say, yep, this is all fine, just go ahead, you can sign, right? But then over time, the more we have built a relationship and you have built your investment, the less there is a need for every little detail to be reviewed.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's another big thing that I found on your website. And obviously it's something that you are very passionate about talking about. I've noticed on your podcast is this passion for coaching and mentoring. Where did that come from? Like, why that, and why not just invest for yourself and move on with life?
Well, for one, it comes from kind of an inherent thing, really. I know kind of the core deep thing for me is to help other people. But several people have asked me if I know what triggered it. And it might sound a little bit over the top when I answer that now, but I think it was triggered from the desire to make sure that people don't die. And what I mean by that, I mentioned that I was in the Air Force, and yes, in the beginning I was in the test team. But remember, I said part of my job became to help develop a new flight training center for young pilots and navigators who just came out of their training and then were to come to our training center to learn how to fly the real jet, I always said, right? The one that really has rockets and bombs and stuff. Because through training, you go and learn flying on training aircraft, but then at some point you get assigned to your real plane, right? So that's what this training center was for. And when you start flying the real thing, there is also a real risk of dying. Not because the enemy shoots you out of the sky, but because you really, it's the same thing if you say, okay, I learned how to drive a car. You can safely navigate. Now, if you say, okay, now I want to do, I don't know, the Paris-Dakar rally, or I want to do NASCAR, or I want to do Formula One, or I want to do IndyCar racing. It's a totally different level than just being able to drive a car on the highway. So that's kind of what I always say. People ask me, for example, you might chuckle about this, when I finished my career in the Air Force as a test pilot and all this stuff, they said, didn't you want to fly for the airlines? Because a lot of my friends did. And I said, you know, think about it. If you were a NASCAR or Formula One driver or an IndyCar driver, and somebody said, wouldn't you like to drive a school bus? Right. And so
that is a comparison I've never heard, but makes perfect sense. Wow.
Right. Yeah. I mean, basically, I call it takeoff and landing officer with a bunch of school kids behind you, right? Like, so
yeah.
So if you think about it that way, I didn't really feel that was particularly desirable. But the point is, these kids that came to our flight center, I was basically in a capacity together with a lot of other officers to train them, to take them through a learning program so that they could safely operate this real jet that shoots missiles and drops bombs. And I'm sad to say that some people didn't make it, both instructors and some of the students. But for me, I felt a real obligation to make sure that whatever I can do to avoid that they die on the job.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that was one of the core things that said, you know, this is maybe a little bit different than coaching and mentoring, but it's a way of helping people to get professional enough to survive the challenges of life. And in a way, we're doing this now in a financial way, what I used to do in a really literal way when it came to operating a very risky, very, complex piece of equipment at insane speeds and insane altitudes and so forth.
And honestly, for some people, I'm sure that enter into this mentoring program at Ideal Wealth Grower, it probably feels very similar to some of the kids that were, getting into a plane for the first time. Obviously, very, very different. But also, like, I can honestly say that I would be maybe equally as confused trying to invest in real estate without a mentor as I would be trying to fly a plane without a mentor. One of them is
right, exactly.
more
and
dangerous,
one of the things, you're absolutely right, Michael. And one of the core things is, and I wrote an article, and anybody who wants to look at this, is what I call the guardian of risk is discipline, right? Like if you say, okay, I'm willing to take some risk, how can I make sure that it's not over the top? And that is discipline. And the discipline that you need to operate your fighter jet at the limit without going over is maybe not as, detrimental or severe when you do investing in real estate, but it's a very complex area. On the other hand, very, very rewarding, and it will never go away, right? So that means if you want to do it right and you want to do it successful, it takes discipline. And that's also partially, you haven't asked me this, I'm just going to volunteer. Some people that listen to us might say, how come that you focus almost exclusively on residential real estate? So single family, duplex, triplex, fourplex.
It's a great question. I'm glad I asked it.
Yeah, well, the answer is because you can really get deep and get good at one specific thing, one specific category. And to anybody who says, well, I do a little bit of residential and then I would like to get into a apartment complex and then maybe a mall, and I could also see storage units and trailer parks. And I say, that's great. For that first part where I'm the expert, I'm happy to help you. When you need and really feel that you need these other ones, you go to experts that can help you with that. But it's the same as if you say, well, I like car racing. I want to start with NASCAR, and then 2 years later, I want to go Indy, and then 2 years later, I want to do rally. And you have to ask yourself, can you ever really get really good at it? Right. And to me, I decided, okay, I can focus on one thing and really dig deep. And that's what I'm providing. And part of this is not just the education, but you can imagine since 2007, 8, I have developed a really large network of resources, because I'm always, as a guinea pig, go ahead and say, if we try something new, I'm the one who's risking my money to try and see how it works.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it works well and we integrate it. Sometimes it doesn't. Like, for example, I wanted to buy an eco-friendly tiny house in Panama. All looked perfect until I tried it. And ultimately, their culture of not really being able to do financial transactions in a professional way, it cost me a few $1,000s, but it was a good lesson. So none of our clients ever has to do that particular project. Right. And so obviously the vast majority, I'm glad to say, worked out. And all these relationships to insurance, to lenders, to turnkey providers, to different kinds of investment opportunities, that cash flow platform, all of that is not broadly described on the website. But it's not just me trying to help you to decide which house do you buy, but how do you do it the right way? And that's these relationships. And you can imagine me having worked with some of these organizations for 10 years, when I say, hey, Michael is one of my clients and he is in need of a house and insurance and lending and stuff, they treat you a little different because they know that you're one of our tribe members. And if they don't make you happy, they make me angry, and they don't want that.
Yes, I can absolutely understand that and relate to that. And honestly, I'm something you said that I think is really important, and I just want to kind of focus real quick is I'm a firm believer that the best mentors, the best teachers, the best coaches are the ones that have failed a lot. So you mentioned Tom Brady earlier. I am a very, very big football fan from Philadelphia. I'm a big Eagles fan. I think some of the best coaches in the league, like the Eagles coach who won the Super Bowl, Doug Peterson, aren't the ones that, are the Tom Brady's, the ones that won 8 Super Bowls or whatever. They're the ones that were like career-long backups and have dealt with the trials, the tribulations of failing over and over and over, because they don't only know how to succeed, they know how to not fail. And sometimes that's way more important than only knowing how to succeed, because when you reach those roadblocks, you can say, this is how you get over it. Or like you said with the house in Panama, you just know how to completely avoid that roadblock. You're like, no, I failed. I'm washing my hands of it. You don't need to ever do that because I've tried it. You can trust me. It's not worth it. So I think that's super important.
Right. Yeah. And I think Bruce Arians is another example, right?
Yes.
Like, would fall into that. Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And part of the things that I believe is, and I say this actually to our mentoring clients, I don't mind hiding it here on the podcast either, is when you seek an advisor, might be a financial advisor or an advisor for anything else, you want to make sure, and I highly always encourage to ask the question, tell me in detail, not in broad strokes, in detail, what have you yourself really done that is exactly the thing that you're trying to get me to do?
Yeah.
Right. And so when people come, they can look at the website, I can show them the properties, they can call anybody that I refer them to, and so forth and so forth. I'm sad to say there are sadly too many people who say, well, you should do ABC. Here's an online training program. And if you had the opportunity to say, okay, show me how much of ABC have you actually done and what was the result? You will be shocked how often you find that they have all kinds of excuses why they haven't gotten around to actually doing what they want you to do.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's a huge differentiator. And I'm happy to say, ask me anything in my niche. And if I don't know, I will tell you and I will find out, so it will never happen again.
I love that. I mean, I agree that that's the right attitude and that's the right way to approach it. And when I'm looking for a mentor in in any facet. That's what I'm looking for. So,
and that also helps you to have the strong conviction that,
yes.
you know, as long as I'm around and I can help you to reach your time freedom point, you know, that's important to me, especially because in that sense, we talked at the very beginning of our conversation, why am I in Spain? Because I reached my time freedom point and I have freedom to say, where do I want to spend the winter? And I decided it's Spain.
Anywhere that's warm. So yeah, exactly. So I've really enjoyed talking to you, Axel. I actually think that I could probably do this for like another couple of hours. So well, that's why I need to stop myself now. But before we go, I do want to ask, please plug yourself. Tell our listeners where they can find you. I've already mentioned it a couple times, but I want to hear it coming from you. Where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned, and I'm grateful that you said idealwealthgrower.com is the website. And if anybody wants to contact me directly, you just put Axel, and you see this here, AXEL at idealwealthgrower.com. That's my email directly. And those would be the best ways. And I mean, my web guy made it so like, you know, it pops up 30 seconds in for the newsletter and the strategy session and so forth. So if you have a little more than 1 minute patience, you get all the opportunities to connect with us somehow.
And if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to listen to his podcast as well, The Ideal Investor Show. All of this stuff will be in the description of this episode. But yes, Axel, thank you so much for joining me. I really, really did have a great time talking about all this stuff. I learned a lot today, and really that's why I'm here. I'm here to learn about financial freedom. And finally, just before we go, real quick, if you could just tell me what financial freedom means to you. If you could tell our listeners, I think that would be a great way to end this show.
Well, like I said earlier, for me, it means having the freedom to do with the most precious thing we all have, which is time, whatever you want to do, and not let other people tell you what you need to do.
I love that, and it's very well said. Axel, thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully, we talk again soon. And on behalf of myself, on behalf of Axel, and on behalf of Camaplan, thank you for listening. And I'll see you next time. If you'd like to get started with investing in the assets you've heard about on the road to financial freedom, reach out to Camaplan using the phone number in the description, and we'll help you get started in just a few minutes.